The frontier was a crucible that devoured innocence, and few lives illustrate this tragic consumption more starkly than that of Thomas O'Folliard. Though his name rarely gleams with the cruel fame afforded to his compatriots, his destiny was inextricably linked to the most kinetic figure of the age, Billy the Kid. He was the loyal shadow, the second in command, a boy whose path from quiet Texas ranchland to a shallow grave in Fort Sumner was paved entirely by his allegiance to William H. Bonney. This is the chronicle of a true believer, a man whose end was sealed the moment he first clasped hands with the Kid. Hey everyone, if you enjoy deep dives into history and epic stories, don't forget to hit the subscribe button right now for helping us, and let us know in the comments which city and country you are watching us from. Born in 1858, Thomas O'Folliard's genesis was one of sorrow and sudden loss. His parents, Irish immigrants seeking refuge and fortune in the rugged promise of America, were claimed not by a desperado's bullet, but by the unseen ruthless hand of smallpox while Thomas was still a boy. Orphaned and adrift, he was raised by relatives in the sun-scorched plains of Uvalde, Texas, an unforgiving environment where survival often meant crossing the thin line separating honest labor from illicit gain. It was here, in his early youth, that O'Folliard took his first definitive step into the abyss of outlawry, not as a desperate act of subsistence, but through association. He forged a fateful partnership with Emil Fritz, a man whose influence proved both magnetic and corrosive. Together, the two boys dipped their hands into the simmering pot of frontier crime, initiating their careers by the swift, quiet theft of horses, a crime universally despised and harshly punished, marking them as men outside the pale of common respectability. This life of petty crime was merely the apprenticeship for the deeper, bloodier work to come. Through Fritz's ambition and restless spirit, the path soon led away from the known dangers of Texas and into the greater chaos brewing in New Mexico territory. This journey was not merely a change of landscape, it was a collision with destiny. It was there, amidst the dust and simmering rivalries of the Pecos Valley, that Thomas O'Folliard met the legend, the charismatic mercurial outlaw who would forever define his brief existence, Billy the Kid, William H. Bonney. The two young men, both orphaned by circumstance, both possessing an effortless facility for violence, recognized an instant kinship. They saw in each other a mirror reflecting the broken promise of the West and the intoxicating freedom of the open road. This personal bond swiftly hardened into a political and military alliance as the vast simmering corporate feud, known as the Lincoln County War, boiled over. O'Folliard, Fritz, and the Kid threw their lot in with the Alexander McSween faction, siding with the interests opposing the powerful, entrenched, and often corrupt house of Murphy and Dolan. Their choice was immediate, final, and absolute. They committed their lives and their guns not just to a cause, but to each other. O'Folliard was no longer merely a horse thief. He was now a soldier in an undeclared civil war, a loyal combatant in a struggle that would soon demand the ultimate price from every man who stood beside Billy the Kid. His shoulder would soon taste its first bullet, a grim, painful initiation that symbolized the fate awaiting all who followed the magnetic pull of the Kid's dangerous path. The quiet boy from Uvalde was gone. The outlaw, the second in command, had been forged. The crucible of the Lincoln County War wasted no time in testing the mettle of Thomas O'Folliard, marking him physically for the violent path he had chosen. The conflict's initiation proved painful and prophetic. On February 18, 1878, O'Folliard suffered his first recorded wound, struck in the shoulder by a bullet. This injury was not a glorious end to a duel, but an early, searing consequence of the escalating tensions, serving as a brutal, visceral reminder that the price of allegiance was paid in blood and pain. He was now a wounded combatant in a war that had barely begun. The simmering tensions that had afflicted the region, the economic rivalry between the established Murphy-Dolan mercantile and political ring, known simply as the House, and the newcomer Alexander McSween and his English partner, John Tunstall, suddenly exploded into an irreversible full-scale feud. The detonating moment was the murder of John Tunstall. On that same day, February 18th, a posse of law enforcement officers, influenced by the House, intercepted Tunstall as he, along with several ranch hands, including Richard Dick Brewer, Billy the Kid, John Middleton, and Fred Waite, were herding his remaining horses back to the safety of Lincoln. The subsequent investigation, spearheaded by Special Investigator Frank Warner Angel, confirmed the appalling truth. Tunstall was not accidentally killed in a skirmish, but was mercilessly shot dead by members of the opposing faction, specifically Jesse Evans, William Morton, and Tom Hill. Tunstall's murder was witnessed from a distance by several members of his own party, including the shock-stricken Richard Brewer and Billy the Kid. The sight of their unarmed employer and mentor being coldly executed by the rival faction's enforcers, allegedly under the cover of legal process, ignited a burning, unquenchable thirst for vengeance. This tragic event was not merely a crime. It was the catalyst that officially plunged Lincoln County into war. The deep sense of moral outrage was magnified by the pervasive belief that the territorial criminal justice system was utterly compromised, heavily influenced and controlled by the allies of Murphy and Dolan, making any hope for legal recourse impossible. In the wake of this audacious, lawless act, the vaqueros, ranch hands, and local citizens who had worked for Tunstall and who opposed the corruption of the House coalesced into a fighting unit. Motivated by a desperate desire for justice in a land where the law had failed them, they collectively formed the vigilante group known to history as the Regulators. The establishment of this group marked the transition of the conflict from an economic dispute into a genuine civil war. While the ranks of the Regulators would, at various times, swell to include dozens of American and Mexican cowboys, the core military power was vested in a small, tight-knit cadre of fighters. This elite group, often referred to as the Ironclad due to their fierce reputation and unwavering commitment, included such formidable figures as McCarty, Billy the Kid, the group's first captain, Richard Dick Brewer, Frank McNabb, Doc Skurlock, Jim French, John Middleton, George Coe, Frank Coe, Jose Chavez Y. Chavez, Charlie Baudry, Fred Waite, Henry Newton Brown, and of course, Tom O'Folliard. The creation of the Regulators was a direct act of defiance against the established powers. Under the purported authority of a local justice of the peace, they determined to act where the corrupted sheriff would not. Their first and most urgent objective was clear and unforgiving: to take action against the members of the sheriff's team directly responsible for Tunstall's murder. They sought justice, even if it had to be administered at the barrel of a gun. The dust of New Mexico Territory, 1878, was not merely soil. It was pulverized history, choked with the blood of good men and the greed of great ones. The air, thin and dry, tasted of gunpowder and righteous fury. It was into this crucible that the legend of the Lincoln County War was forged, and at its incandescent center stood a brotherhood of vengeance known as the Regulators. They did not call themselves a gang. They were the Ironclad. They were not outlaws in their own minds, but instruments of balance drawn together by a singular, blinding spark of injustice: the murder of John Tunstall. Tunstall, the young, aristocratic English rancher, had been their patron, their mentor, and for many, the only honest hope in a land suffocating under the corruption of the Murphy-Dolan faction. When the bullets of a sheriff's posse cut Tunstall down on a sun-drenched day, the established legal orders ceased to exist for his men. They did not appeal. They armed. At the heart of this compact was the inner circle, the Ironclad itself, a collection of souls bound by mutual danger and a desperate sense of purpose. Among them stood the central fire, Henry McCarty, better known to history as Billy the Kid. He was the coiled spring, the astonishingly young and lethal embodiment of their rage. Beside him was Dick Brewer, the appointed captain, a man whose steady, moral hand attempted to guide the wild currents of their collective fury. Doc Skurlock, the man of learning who chose the rifle over the book, and the quiet, deadly precision of Jim French provided the necessary ballast. But it was the peripheral figures, the men of unflinching loyalty, who gave the ironclad its mass and its name. Frank McNabb, soon to command the group, and the loyal, darkly fated Tom O'Folliard, whose youthful devotion to McCarty would become the signature of his tragic end. Completing the grim role were the relentless Charlie Baudry and the enigmatic mestizo killer, Jose Chavez y Chavez, a figure who moved between worlds, carrying the darkness of both. They were a hammer forged in blood, and their first strike was imminent. The target was immediate and clear: William Morton, a man who had ridden in the posse that executed Tunstall, and Frank Baker, a man unfortunate enough to be near Morton, though possibly innocent of the initiating crime. The regulators' pursuit was swift, driven by the urgency of men who knew their own clock was ticking. They caught their quarry, and the inevitable moment arrived, the point at which a vigilante group either becomes a force for temporary justice or descends irrevocably into pure murder. Captain Dick Brewer, attempting to cling to the thin sliver of legality that still defined their mission, offered a solemn promise. The prisoners, Morton and Baker, would be taken alive to Lincoln to stand trial. But the wilderness of the territory and the raw ache of vengeance proved stronger than Brewer's authority. The majority of the ironclad looked not at the men before them, but at the fading image of Tunstall's body, riddled with slugs. Their verdict was instantaneous. Trial was for the corrupt courts. Execution was for the righteous. Then came the singular, terrible act that defined the moment, crossing the invisible line from rough justice to cold-blooded atrocity. A writer named William McCloskey, who had been riding with Morton and was crucially his friend, intervened. He spoke against the execution, a voice of sanity and mercy crying out in the barren expanse. His plea was met not with debate, but with a swift, brutal finality. McCloskey was silenced, shot down alongside the two prisoners, not for any crime against Tunstall, but for the unforgivable sin of advocating decency. 3 bodies lay sprawled in the dust, and with them died the final pretense of the regulators' legitimacy. They had begun as agents of justice seeking redress. They had ended as men of indiscriminate blood, sealing their own fate. The ironclad was now truly forged, hardened not just by righteous fire, but by the shame of an unnecessary murder. That day, they learned that the path of revenge spares no one, not even the advocate of the enemy. The laughter of Ermicon's counterparts years later would be mirrored by the bitter, silent knowledge that settled upon the ironclad as they rode away, leaving behind 3 corpses and the stench of their own irreversible descent into infamy. The Kid and his men had taken their first steps into the mythic darkness, cementing their reputation as both heroes and murderers, the iron of their purpose now stained crimson. The Lincoln County War was not decided by a single bullet, but by the relentless grinding weight of 5 infernal days. By mid-July 1878, the conflict, ignited by the assassination of John Tunstall, had ceased to be a series of sporadic ambushes and evolved into a full-scale siege. The regulators now marked men and, driven into a corner by the powerful Murphy-Dolan faction, made their final desperate stand in the dusty heart of Lincoln Town. For 5 agonizing days, from July 15th to the 19th, the fate of the territory hung suspended in the thick, suffocating smoke that settled over the 2 fortress-like strongholds, the McSween House and the adjacent Ellis store. Tom O'Folliard, young, fiercely loyal, and now utterly hardened by the bloodshed, found himself trapped within the most symbolic of the 2 defenses, the spacious but vulnerable adobe fortress of the McSween home. This was not merely a house. It was the nerve center of the resistance, the very heart of the cause they were fighting for, held by the most uncompromising members of the ironclad. Beside O'Folliard stood the man he practically worshipped, Billy the Kid, his youthful lethality honed to a terrifying edge. This nucleus of survival included the fragile and idealistic owner, Alexander McSween, and his unyielding wife, Susan, whose presence served as a desperate moral shield against the carnage raging outside. The house was a powder keg, its occupants a gallery of resolute fighters. Henry Brown, the deadly efficiency of Jim French, the dependable Charlie Baudry, and the shadow of violence that was José Chavez, Way Chavez. For O'Folliard, this house was the entire world compressed into four walls, and every moment was a shared breath with men destined for the gallows or the grave. The siege itself was a grueling, agonizing test of wills. The Murphy-Dolan faction, backed by local law enforcement and overwhelming firepower, poured relentless lead into the defenses. Days bled into nights under the constant rhythm of gunfire. Inside the McSween house, the air was a haze of plaster dust, sweat, and despair. Ammunition dwindled, supplies vanished, and the morale of the defenders was tested to its breaking point. The ironclad held fast, returning fire with the precision of desperation, knowing that surrender meant swift execution. They fought not for victory, which had become a distant dream, but for survival, for the right to breathe one more day. The arrival of the United States Army, under the command of Colonel Nathan Dudley, only served to twist the moral knife. Dudley, ostensibly present to restore order, was perceived by the regulators as yet another layer of government complicity, a vast, indifferent military machine unwilling to intervene on the side of justice, but very capable of ensuring the destruction of the men he considered rebels. While the army prevented an all-out bloodbath across the entire town, its presence tightened the noose around the McSween house, discouraging any attempt at external relief. The climax of the 5-day ordeal, the inescapable moment of reckoning, arrived on the afternoon of July 19th. The opponents, frustrated by the unyielding defiance of the ironclad, made their ultimate, savage move. They set the McSween house on fire. The blaze began slowly, a curl of smoke that soon became a roaring, hungry beast. The flames, consuming the dry adobe and timber, became a fifth, terrifying enemy. Trapped by the inferno within and the bullets without, the situation became utterly hopeless. O'Folliard and his comrades faced the most brutal choice: be consumed by the fire or brave the onslaught of gunfire outside. The heat and smoke soon became unbearable, forcing the remnants of the ironclad into a final suicidal action. As twilight bled into night, the surviving defenders launched their desperate, spectacular break for freedom. Billy the Kid, O'Folliard, Baudry, and French burst from the burning ruins, their figures momentarily silhouetted against the colossal blaze that was the tomb of their cause. It was a charge of pure, blind instinct, a final defiant act of human will against overwhelming odds. The air filled with the frantic roar of rifles and shotguns as the fleeing men scattered, running directly into the enemy line. In that chaotic, fire-lit storm, the fate of the leaders was sealed. Alexander McSween, the peaceful man who stood by his house and his cause, was gunned down, his death a fatal blow to the regulators' legitimacy. Others fell, but O'Folliard, running shoulder to shoulder with the relentless Kid, tasted the raw, desperate victory of survival. They sliced through the surrounding circle of fire and lead, their speed and the blinding terror of the conflagration providing the necessary cover. They had lost the battle, they had lost their sanctuary, and they had lost their leader, but they had not lost their lives. O'Folliard, Billy the Kid, and the surviving members of the ironclad emerged from the smoke, baptized in fire, forever transformed from men fighting for a cause into legendary fugitives, marked by the stain of the siege and the burning memory of the house they could not save. The thunder of the ironclad had been muted, but the legend of the Kid had just begun to roar. The retreat from the burning McSween house was not a flight, but a calculated detonation, a final lethal calculation executed under the most desperate conditions imaginable. The colossal flames of July 19th had rendered the fortress untenable, transforming the adobe walls from shelter into a roaring furnace. Inside, the surviving core of the ironclad men like Charlie Baudry, a figure of grim determination, the hyper-aware and terrifyingly kinetic Billy the Kid, and the steadfast Jim French came together in the flickering, choking heat. They did not debate tactics. They simply recognized the singular, non-negotiable imperative: breach the containment or perish in the ashes. Their survival hinged on exploiting the chaos their own impending deaths were meant to create. The Murphy-Dolan faction, confident in the consuming power of the fire, had tightened its cordon but had grown complacent, focusing on the blazing spectacle rather than the strategic collapse of the rear. The three principals, Baudry, the Kid, and French, knew that a direct dash would be suicide. Instead, they focused on the narrow window of opportunity, the rear door, obscured by the house's infernal shadow and the confusion of the surrounding night. The strategy was brutally simple, a synchronized dash, relying on the immediate burst of gunfire to momentarily blind and stun the enemy line, creating a fracture in the siege through which the men could pour out. The command was given, perhaps a single nod or a whispered word lost to the roar of the consuming fire. Jim French was chosen to lead the charge, a man of unflinching courage whose task was to be the battering ram, the first to face the shockwave of enemy fire. He flung himself through the rear entrance, his rifle blazing, followed immediately by the lean, deadly form of Billy the Kid, who moved with the preternatural speed that had already made him a legend. Tucked tightly behind the Kid was Tom O'Folliard. O'Folliard's position in the sequence was a testament to his loyalty and reliability. He was part of the immediate, critical wave, the shield and support for the leadership, a man whose gun would not waver. The tight, desperate phalanx continued with the silent, menacing presence of José Chavez y Chavez and the remaining loyalists, all hurtling into the pitch-black exterior, illuminated only by the inferno at their backs and the muzzle flashes ahead. The eruption from the rear door was instantaneous and total. It was not a trickle of men, but a violent expulsion of gunfire and desperate human mass. The surrounding enemy position instantly dissolved into a maelstrom of shock and lead. Shots hammered the fleeing men, and return fire erupted from the ironclad. The sheer, terrifying speed of the escape attempt disoriented the besiegers. Yet, survival came at a steep immediate price. The chaos, while providing cover, also claimed the unfortunate. Harvey Morris, a young law partner of McSween, whose skills lay in the courtroom and not the gunfight, was caught in the deadly crossfire. His presence in the house was a civilian devotion to the cause, and he became an instant casualty, a tragic footnote to the main event. Morris fell, an unnecessary sacrifice to the raw physics of escape, his death underscoring the lethal gamble O'Folliard and the others had taken. The surviving core of the ironclad scattered, abandoning the town that was now a pyre and a graveyard. The successful breach was a victory measured not in ground gained, but in breaths taken. They melted into the shadows of the surrounding brush, their lungs burning from the smoke, their ears ringing with the sounds of the battle they had just left behind. O'Folliard had faced down the greatest organized threat the territory could muster. He had witnessed the death of the cause's champion, McSween, and the murder of an innocent supporter, Morris. His loyalty to Billy the Kid was now cemented, not just by shared goals, but by shared trauma. They had faced the fire and walked out of the flames together. This successful savage breakout ensured that the Lincoln County War would not end with a single clean surrender. It guaranteed the continuation of the bloody drama, transforming Billy the Kid, Charlie Baudry, and Tom O'Folliard from besieged rebels into the most wanted, most elusive fugitives in the American West. They left behind a burning monument to their defiance, carrying with them nothing but their guns and the indelible proof that they were too dangerous to corner and too determined to kill. They had escaped the fire, but they had merely traded one siege for the eternal, relentless manhunt that was to follow. They were survivors now, bound for the open territory and the next inevitable confrontation. The ashes of the McSween house marked the end of the Lincoln County War, but for Tom O'Folliard and his companions, it was the beginning of an endless fugitive existence. Having violently broken free from the siege, the surviving nucleus of the ironclad exchanged the structured conflict of a territorial war for the raw, untamed life of the frontier outlaw. For the next 2 years, from the smoldering ruins of Lincoln in 1878, until the bitter end of 1880. O'Follard remained the shadow and strength of Billy the Kid. Their existence became a relentless cycle of necessity and audacity, surviving in the remote reaches of the New Mexico territory, utilizing the vast, indifferent landscape as their sanctuary. Their primary occupation was the acquisition of livestock, an enterprise the law termed cattle rustling and the fugitives saw as simply provision. They moved herds across the vast distances, selling them in towns far removed from the jurisdiction of their enemies, weaving a complex web of loyalty among sympathetic ranchers and small-time operators. The group naturally expanded, drawing in other men of desperate ambition, their reputation preceding them. This collection of hard-riding, quick-shooting men crystallized into the infamous Billy the Kid gang. Yet, within this amorphous, constantly shifting collection of loyalists, O'Follard's position was fixed and central. He was not merely a member, but the Kid's undisputed second-in-command. This was a designation earned not through ambition, but through unswerving, proven loyalty, forged in the fire of the McSween siege. O'Follard was the most reliable executor of the Kid's increasingly reckless decisions, the man beside him in the saddle, and the last line of defense in a gunfight. He was the Kid's mirror in defiance, slightly less famous, perhaps less volatile, but equally devoted to the life they had chosen. This brief, wild reign of the Kid's gang across the territory was destined to collide violently with the relentless force of order, embodied in the singular figure of mythic persistence, Sheriff Pat Garrett. Garrett, a towering, taciturn man who had once been an associate of the very men he now hunted, possessed an intimate understanding of the outlaws' movements, their habits, and their few points of predictable weakness. His appointment as sheriff was a tacit recognition that only a former friend could truly bring down the Kid, initiating one of the most famous and grimly inevitable manhunts in the history of the American West. Garrett's pursuit was not routine police work. It was a personal vendetta cloaked in the badge of law, an inexorable closing of a trap that neither side could avoid. The clock ran out on the gang in the desolate, windswept adobe settlement of Fort Sumner, New Mexico, a place that had offered sanctuary and anonymity for too long. Garrett and his deputies, men like Lon Chambers, had studied the gang's pattern of retreat. They knew the outlaws would eventually gravitate to the comfort of friends and familiar hearths, and Garrett positioned his men, setting a cold-blooded trap near a familiar, welcoming outpost. The ambush was a calculated betrayal of the frontier's unwritten rules, a final necessary act of deceit by the hunter. On the night of December 19, 1880, O'Follard, riding with the Kid and other members of the gang, approached the prepared position. The atmosphere of the frigid night was shattered by a command that instantly tore the veil of peace. Garrett ordered them to halt. For the outlaw, a direct command to stop is a command to die. In the split second of frozen realization, O'Follard reacted not as a second-in-command, but as a cornered wolf. The moment Garrett's voice cut through the darkness, O'Follard's hand instinctively darted towards the weapon holstered on his hip. It was a reflex born of 2 years of constant danger, an automatic, desperate attempt to initiate the fight before being massacred. This was the final, fatal gamble. O'Follard was too fast to freeze, but tragically, he was too slow to win. Before his fingers could fully secure the butt of his gun, the sudden brilliant flare of a muzzle flash erupted from Garrett's position. A heavy-caliber bullet, fired by the relentless sheriff himself, tore through the darkness. The projectile struck O'Follard squarely in the chest. He fell from the saddle, his life extinguishing instantly, a final, unceremonious punctuation mark on a short, violent existence. O'Follard, the unwavering shadow of the Kid, the man who had charged out of the burning McSween house, was the first casualty of Garrett's final campaign. He died an emblem of misplaced loyalty and an epitaph to the 2 years of freedom the gang had stolen from the law. His death sent a clear, chilling message into the frozen night. The hunter was no longer waiting. He was shooting. The era of the ironclad was over, and the clock was ticking relentlessly toward the solitary, legendary end of Billy the Kid himself. The night that consumed Tom O'Folliard on December 19, 1880, was instantly carved into the grim timeline of the frontier. The shot fired by Sheriff Pat Garrett that struck the young man squarely in the chest was not merely a bullet. It was the definitive, terrifying warning that the era of impunity for Billy the Kid's gang was over. As O'Folliard fell from his saddle, the immediate reaction of the remaining outlaws, including the Kid himself, was primal and swift: retreat. The Kid and the others, momentarily stunned by the sudden lethal efficiency of Garrett's ambush, wheeled their horses, melting back into the impenetrable darkness, prioritizing survival over vengeance. They left their wounded comrade on the cold ground, a necessary, brutal abandonment that spoke volumes of their desperate circumstances. The ironclad had fractured irreversibly. Left alone in the chilling embrace of the New Mexico night, O'Folliard's final moments were a searing portrait of human vulnerability stripped bare by violence. The bullet from Garrett's rifle had delivered a mortal wound, but death was not instantaneous. As the life force drained from his body, the fierce spirit that had propelled him through the burning ruins of the McSween house and across 2 years of desperate freedom finally broke. Sheriff Garrett and Deputy Lon Chambers cautiously approached the fallen figure, their weapons still aimed, unsure if the outlaw was merely feigning injury. What they found was not the defiant second-in-command of the most feared gang in the territory, but a young man collapsing beneath the weight of his fate. In a voice weakened by the hemorrhaging wound in his chest, Thomas O'Folliard surrendered his final resistance. His words, chillingly preserved by the records of the men who killed him, were a plea not for rescue, but for cessation. "Don't shoot, Garrett. I'm done." In that single sentence, the entire struggle of the ironclad was distilled, the recognition of irreversible defeat. The battle of 2 years was over. As the agony intensified, O'Folliard's plea shifted from surrender to a terrible final request for mercy. He begged the sheriff, his executioner, to put an end to his suffering, the last, despairing whisper of a 22-year-old realizing his short, violent odyssey was complete. This moment of raw, supplicating weakness stands in stark contrast to the legend of the cold-blooded gunfighter. It reveals the terrified boy who had always ridden in the shadow of the Kid. Garrett, who had known O'Folliard in better days, showed the grim professional detachment necessary for the task, but he could do nothing to stop the inevitable flow of life. Approximately 1 hour after being struck by Garrett's devastating shot, Thomas O'Folliard succumbed to his injuries. He died at the heartbreakingly young age of 22, his potential for anything other than violence extinguished by the relentless forces of the law he had so aggressively opposed. His brief life, spent as the loyal second to the territory's most famous outlaw, had culminated in a lonely death, far from the warmth of a fire or the camaraderie of his gang. The sheriff's grim duty was to document the death of a notorious criminal, but the final poetic irony of O'Folliard's life would be his resting place. He was laid to rest in the old Fort Sumner Cemetery, a desolate patch of ground that ironically became the nexus of outlaw immortality. This small, wind-battered plot was already home to the victims of the Lincoln County War, but it was destined to receive its most famous residents in quick succession. O'Folliard was interred beside his loyal dead companions. His resting place became a gathering spot for the fallen heroes of the ironclad. The 2 men who would soon follow him, succumbing to the same relentless, inevitable pursuit by Pat Garrett, were laid beside him. O'Folliard was joined first by Charlie Baudry, who would fall just days later in another ambush, and finally by the man who defined his life, Billy the Kid, murdered by Garrett in the same area barely 6 months later. The 3 young men who had charged out of the burning McSween house together now shared a silent, permanent sanctuary. They were interred in the same bleak, unforgiving soil, an eternal, silent testament to their brief, explosive alliance. They died outside the law, but in the final ledger of the West, they achieved an ironic form of immortality, forever bound together in the ground of Fort Sumner, their shared grave a haunting monument to loyalty, violence, and the tragedy of the frontier. The ironclad was broken, its mission failed, but its legend was cemented in that final shared burial plot. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the epic yet tragic saga of the ironclad and Tom O'Folliard, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing for more historical narratives and epic analyses of forgotten figures from the frontier. And let us know in the comments which city and country you are watching us from.